Hello and welcome to the first in the series of Oxford Reading Hive interviews. I'm delighted to welcome the author of 12 Minutes to Midnight, The Many Words of I'll Be Bright, The Jamie Drake Equation, and most recently The Infinite Lives of Maisie Day, which has been nominated for the 2019 Carnegie Medal. When he isn't writing fiction, he encourages the next generation of writers through his school visits, festival appearances, and his children's guides to writing fiction. How to write your best story ever, and how to be a young writer. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce and chat to Christopher Edge today.
Thank you for that.
All right. We've got a number of questions, so we'll just dive straight in if that's all right.
That's great.
Great. You've written historical novels, or those that you've called twisted histories, and recently your writing has been focused more on the world of science. I get the impression that you're quite a voracious reader. What interested and what inspired you as a child, and what creatively inspires you today?
Yeah, I think you were right to say I'm a voracious reader.
Okay,
basically,
good.
I was a child built by books. So I was like left in my local library to kind of roam. So I always say I was raised by feral librarians. So I used to love reading stories. And I used to love reading lots of different types of stories, like from The Hobbit to books like The Darkest Rising, The Old Dow, The Untitled Chapter. So I kind of roved far and wide on the shelves of my library. And that's where I think I got them. That's where what made me into that. I think if you fill yourself up with enough stories, eventually your brain gets so filled up, your own stories start coming out. Yeah. And kind of nowadays, I find inspiration, when you're trying to write a story, inspiration is all around you. And often it's about finding these little sparks of inspiration that inspire you, whether it's something that you read or something you hear. Yeah. And lots of times it's then about joining those ideas together, which will turn a spark of inspiration into a story.
Now, since you said spark, because my next question actually was, what tends to come first? The possibilities posed by the science, especially in the most recent ones, or is it the spark from the character? What?
My stories usually kind of tend almost exclusively to start with character. So I have an idea for the character in my head. So with a book I wrote called The Many Words of I'll Be Bright, which is about a boy called Albie, whose mum and dad are both scientists, but before the book starts, something very sad happens to Albie. He loses his mum to cancer, and then decides to use quantum physics to look for the parallel universe where he can find her again. And that idea kind of started from a sentence I read in a popular science book that described cancer as a quantum killer, a disease that's caused by a single cell in your body going rogue. Yeah. And when I read that sentence, I just got an image in my head of a boy who might have lost his mum to cancer, and the idea of how he might want to use science to find her again, and how he'd go about doing that. So the spark of the story was something I read, but it sparked a character. Yeah. And similar with The Infinite Lives of Maisie Day, that began as an image in my head, but it was an image of a girl opening her front door and seeing an infinite darkness outside her house. And from that image that I imagined, then I had to think, what is the story that went with that? And the story kind of tumbled out.
And it's a kind of chain reaction of it all coming and then all coming together. Yeah. Wow. You create really beautifully realised characters and heroes that children can relate to. How as a writer do you sort of put yourself into different character perspectives? For example, like Maisie's a 10-year-old girl. Do you find that easy to do, or do you get people to sense check it? Do you have children you can show bits to and say, would you say that?
I think when I write characters, I think every character's got a little aspect of myself in them. Okay. But I think with Maisie Day, who's a 10-year-old kind of science whiz, I think there's lots of wish fulfillment on my part. So I only got a grade D in my GCSE physics exam. I think when you're putting yourself into the shoes of a character, and with something like The Infinite Lives of Maisie Day, which is a first-person narrative, Maisie's the person who is telling this story, it's very firmly to look at the world through their eyes and to see how they perceive the world. I kind of, the reason I enjoy writing children's fiction is I think it's the form of fiction where it kind of explores what the world means. It kind of helps you make sense of the world, and it can let you escape from it as well. And the readers, when I go into schools and meet readers at school visits and at festivals, they're filled with this intense curiosity about the world, and that's what Maisie has in that story. That she's got this intense she's got this love of science. It helps her understand how the universe works. So when the universe outside her front door disappears, she's got to use science to try and solve that mystery. So putting that intense curiosity into the character was kind of the key to kind of seeing the world through her eyes.
Okay. We're interested to find a little bit more about how you plan your stories. So for example, in The Many Worlds of Albie Bright, Albie meets lots of alternate versions of himself through his quantum banana theory. Do you make a linear plan, or do you write chunks and then sort of move things around? Is it quite sort of an organic process, or is it very well structured?
It's kind of evolved as kind of writing. When I first started writing, so before I wrote The Many Worlds of Albie Bright, I kind of wrote a series of historical mysteries, which are very heavily researched and set in Victorian times. I used to plan chapter by chapter. I used to write these detailed plans of, in this chapter this is happening, and then this happens. At the end of the chapter, plan was almost as long as the chapter was. And when I in my more recent books, what I tend to have is a sense of I call it the emotional arc of the story. It's kind of I have a sense of where the story begins, I have a sense of where the story ends, and how the character will get there. And with Albie, for example, Albie basically uses quantum physics to travel to these different parallel universes, searching for his mum. So when I plotted the book, I had separate plans for the different universes that he found himself in, and then it was thinking of how those worlds interrelated, and stories about change, stories are essentially about characters and how characters change. So it was how Albie was changed by each of those experiences. When someone asked me when I was writing Many Worlds of Albie, what's it about? And I said to them, it's a wonderful life with quantum physics. Right. Because Albie basically gets to see how his life might have been different in these different parallel worlds. And in each parallel world, he tries to help the version of himself that he meets there put things right. So with something like The Infinite Lives of Maisie Day, which is all set, the majority of the book is set in Maisie's house. I actually downloaded a floor plan from an estate agent's website. Right. I saw a house, I thought, that is Maisie's house. Nice. And it was actually, I plotted the novel using the floor plan. Oh. So this chapter happens in the kitchen, this chapter happens in the bathroom. Yeah. Where's the black hole?
There you go, as a tip. Tom, do you have any more for... So lots of students are being asked to write sort of short bits of fiction or short bits of writing as part of their exams and their studies. Do you have any tips for how to write in sort of quite short, contained pieces?
Yeah, I think the key thing with writing is when you're, it's all about the details that you choose. So basically, you can write a sentence where you can describe an entire army of thousands of people marching across a kind of vast plain. You could describe that in a sentence, but you could also write a sentence of exactly the same length and just describe a single tear rolling down one person's face. And it's your choice of details, the details that you use in your writing that can basically create pictures in the reader's mind. Writing is basically making marks on paper. But it's actually someone else reading those that turns it into these scenes, turns it into these images. So it's thinking about the images you choose to include, the details you choose to include in your writing, and think about what effect you want those to have, what you want to make the reader imagine. So when you're choosing your details, if you're writing something about where you're trying to describe a place where nobody's been before, it might be a fantasy world, you might want to choose details that help them to compare that place to somewhere that they do know about. Or if you're writing a story that's set in the real world, it might be set in a playground or a schoolyard. Everyone's got a picture of a playground or a schoolyard in their head. So you might want to choose the details that show what's different, what's particular about the place that you're describing, that help them to imagine that specific place. Maybe it's that the swing has got one of the chains missing and the chairs dangling down. So it's about your choice of details and how that helps your readers to imagine this place you're describing.
There you go. More broadly, do you have top tips for aspiring writers?
Yes. Here we go.
3 to 5?
3 to 5. 3 tips.
3 tips, go.
If you want to be a writer, every writer is a reader. So by reading other stories, reading lots of stuff, you can get inspiration. You can fill yourself up with words. and then start to use those words as you learn. So if you want to become a writer, you want to write stories, reading stories is the best fuel you can give yourself.
Competitor knowledge.
Yeah. Not competitor knowledge, inspiration.
Inspiration,
you know.
okay.
I think the other thing in terms of writing is, you know, sometimes you look around the bookshop and there's all these books with like, you know, and they look very imposing on the shelves, big thick books. Not so much mine are a little bit thinner. But it can be looking at, but if you wrote a single page of A4 paper, that's probably about 300 words handwritten on a piece of A4 paper. If you did that every day, and I think most people do like just a side of A4 paper every day, after 2.5 months, you've written a whole novel. Yeah. So if you write every day, even if it's just a little, over the course of weeks, you can turn it into a whole novel. Yeah. And the last thing is really kind of like, we do tend to judge ourselves by other people. So we see what other people have done and we think, we can't do something like that. Yeah. But everyone, when you look at a book in a bookshop, that is a finished product. That's been through lots of drafts, that's had editors look at it, that's had lots of people change it and make it better. So when you write something, you think, well, that's not as good as something in the shop, but actually that's your very first go, and you can revise that, you can improve that. Yeah. So it's to turn off that critic that we all have inside our heads that say that's not good enough. It's to ignore that and just focus on getting your story down, because that's basically, you know, everyone has their own story. Everyone's got a unique brain in their head, and they need to be able to kind of like share that.
So read lots, write every day,
yeah,
and don't be afraid to put it down on paper.
Yeah,
brilliant. Which book do you wish you'd written?
Can I give two answers to that?
Of course you can.
First one is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.
Okay.
I think my bank balance.
Bank balance, okay.
Quite nice. And also, that's a book that inspired a generation to read, and I think that's such an amazing thing that J.K. Rowling did there. However, kind of like if I had to think back to the books that made me as a reader, I think one story would probably be Danny the Champion of the World by Roald Dahl, because that's a book that I remember reading as a child and just falling in love with the story. It's a story about a boy, Danny, who goes up with his dad in a caravan near the edge of the woods, and it's a book that I remember then going back to read with my children when they were younger. And it's interesting because when I read that book for the second time as an adult, I read that book with two pairs of eyes. Yeah. I was reading it with the eyes of the child who read the story all those years ago, and then the eyes of someone who's a father himself, and it's a wonderful novel about fatherhood. So yeah, I'd say that one.
Well, I think that's actually all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for coming in and chatting to us. As I said at the start, we are lining up more exciting authors to talk to over the next few months. So if you'd like to submit questions to them, we'll let you know who they are and when they're coming. And you can do this on our Twitter feed, which is at Oxford Ed English, or join our Facebook group, which is the Oxford Reading Hive for Secondary Schools. Our book of the month is going to be Railhead by Philip Reeve. We'll be sharing our thoughts as we read it, and we'd love to hear what you and your students think about it. So thank you, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.